We are going to begin our session this morning by hearing a report back from the co-chairs of the discussion group on agenda item 4, which basically looked at the vision, mission, goals, and targets. This group convened again yesterday from 3 to 6 p.m. and also from 7 to 9 p.m. We would now like to invite Mr. Dastov and Ms. Charlotta to report back on the outcomes of the discussion group. You have the floor.
Thank you, co-chairs. First of all, I want to thank all parties for active participation and fruitful discussions, and prolong our appreciation to Secretariat and co-chairs for support during the discussions held. The discussion group on item 4 met last 2 days, which was well attended, and we co-chairs felt positiveness and constructiveness from delegates attending the discussion. We did a good progress and were able to finalize the non-paper entirely yesterday evening, and based on discussions, we have now prepared the revised non-paper, which identifies different issues and perspectives raised by parties. We co-chairs try to make sure that the non-paper makes it clear that it does not represent any sort of agreement on any particular issue, but only represents the points of view of parties and an input to the process. Despite the good progress made during past days, it is clear to all that there are still a lot of divergent views and very different understanding of what should be in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. By this, we should bear in mind that we have the food for thought for future discussions in order to elaborate the final document. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Co-Chair, for your hard work. And to conclude this, we'd like to conclude this discussion group in such a positive way. I have heard reports that the spirit was good and there was good collaboration, which bodes very well for the future of our work. We will propose that the outcome of this discussion group be annexed to the conclusion of this working group. We will explain further how we make reference to this outcome when we consider the conclusion of the meeting. In addition, there are syntheses prepared by the Secretariat based on the discussion on the cluster in the plenary, which will be annexed to the procedural report. With this, I would like to close agenda item 4. Thank you. We will now be moving to, I see, Bolivia. Bolivia, tienes la palabra.
A clarification question. When you say that we are closing item 4, that means that the non-paper that means that we are accepting the non-paper submitted by the co-chairs as it stands, or is there still the option to provide some tuning on the text to clearly reflect what we were discussing? Please, if you can clarify if that can be done now or we are going to be able to do it later on. Thank you.
Thank you. As for any non-papers, you can provide your comments in writing to the Secretariat at any time. So I encourage you to do so. Thank you. Seeing no others, we are closing agenda item 4 and moving now to agenda item 5. We will now continue our session this morning by considering the conclusion of the meeting, which is contained in CRP 1. Let us now start considering CRP 1 on agenda item 5, future work program of the open-ended working group and allocation of tasks to other intersectional bodies and processes. I would like to go through this document paragraph by paragraph. However, before opening the, just a second. Okay. However, before we start having comment on the paragraphs, there is a few remarks and comments I think you will find useful to keep in mind, and I'd like to make. Annex 2 is the preliminary list of meeting, consultation, and workshop for the development of the 2020 framework. And you will have seen a number of items in this annex, and it may be useful to provide a few more details on how they're organized. You will remember the presentation made on the various thematics. You will also see in the CRP how we reflected the discussion on the requests for further elaboration on other items. In addition, you will remember that for those items that are not covered by thematic or other specialist discussion, the proposal is for Francis and I, based on the consultation and the advice you have given, to draft some language for your review when we get to Open-Ended Working Group 2. So those are the way the various pieces are organized and will be feeding into your discussion. Coming back now to Annex 2. As the title of the Annex points out, it contains a preliminary list of consultation and workshop. As noted before, you have identified some gap, and we may want to have additional workshop added to that list, and that there is a provision to do so in the CRP. We will update the list and keep it evergreen. It will be on the post-2020 website. Recording the discussion with the Bureau yesterday, it was pointed out that SEPSTA could be considering some of the gaps identified by the parties. Francis and I, together with the Secretariat, will meet as soon as possible with the SEPSTA co-chairs to define how we will be tackling that work. And we will update you through our regular blog input. Therefore, we appeal you not to open a discussion on this Annex 2, as the Bureau has extensively discussed this yesterday. Before we start the discussion on the CRP paragraph by paragraph, I would like to give the floor to the Secretariat to introduce some correction. Secretariat, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. I just have, I think, 4 corrections, 5 corrections. Paragraph 2, the dates of the meeting of the working group in Cali should be 27th to 31st July 2020. So again, paragraph 2, the dates of the meeting of the working group in Cali should be 27th to 31st July 2020. Paragraph 10, the paragraph should read, requests the co-chairs of the working group on the post-2020 framework and the executive secretary, and the paragraph continues as is. I repeat, paragraph 10 should read, requests the co-chairs of the working group on the post-2020 framework and the executive secretary, and the paragraph continues as is. In addition, inadvertently, in our rush to send this for translation last night, we forgot one paragraph. We deleted one paragraph by mistake. It should come as after paragraph 7, and it says, invite the executive director of the United Nations Environment Programme, comma, in her capacity as the chair of the UN Environmental Management Group, comma, to facilitate, comma, in collaboration with the members of the group, comma, the contribution of the UN system to the development and implementation of the post-2020 2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. I'll repeat it. Invite the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme in her capacity as the chair of the UN Environmental Management Group to facilitate, in collaboration with the members of the group, the contribution of the UN system to the development and implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We also, lastly, wherever in the document there is a mention of Bureau, it should read COP Bureau. So let me repeat. Wherever there is mention of Bureau in the document, it should read COP Bureau. I also have one correction in the annex. In Annex 2, the consultation on resource mobilization should say January/February and not February/March 2020. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Secretariat. Dear delegates, with those changes in mind, we will now proceed to consider this CRP. We shall go paragraph by paragraph. We will begin with the preambular paragraphs and then go on up to the very end. So the floor is now open, and we are now on preambular paragraph 1. European Union.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair, and thank you for all the work during this week and for the very good synthesis and the drafts that are in front of us. We appreciate that very much. Apologies, I would like to go back to the Annex 2 because we do have a number of suggestions. And just to explain, in our intervention at the start, we said that we had quite a number of questions on how to, on the process, how to do it. And I think we received quite a bit of information, perhaps not all, but also on the basis of the request, we have a number of considerations. And I propose, with your indulgence, that I make the remarks and then can see whether this would be good to have a revised version still, or whether there's another way of dealing with it. But at least that I can set out a couple of things very briefly.
You just a minute.
So, yes?
EU, please go ahead.
So the first remark concerns the line it's the 20 November meeting in Montreal on briefing on review approaches and mechanisms. Of course, as you probably all know, the EU and the member states, I'm speaking on behalf of the EU and the member states, we want to have a good discussion and want to strengthen review and implementation mechanisms. So this topic for us is really very important. For that, we think it should be really organized in the most efficient and effective way. We actually think that a meeting, a one-day meeting back-to-back to Article 8J is not the most effective way, and would rather foresee online consultations, through webinar, on online discussion forum, or other online ways to really prepare the input for the later meeting on review in early 2020. So for us, it already says, of course, to be confirmed, but for us, the consideration would be not to have a meeting, but rather deal with it through electronic means, so that also everybody can contribute to it. The second remark would be on the line, actually on the same, is in January 2020, another workshop on review and approaches and mechanisms is foreseen, whereas also in February, back to Kunming, there's a consultation on review approaches and mechanisms. Actually, for the first, we have the same doubt. It might simply be more effective to seek the views and the technical inputs through written consultations, online discussions, and web means, rather than having 2 workshops or 2 meetings, even if they are different in nature, quite close one after the other. This also just generally reflects I think the need to be very efficient in our resources, because there are so many issues that we need to work on. The third remark would be on the when it concerns SBSTA in May. Elements of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework that are mentioned are validation of goals, targets, and indicators. Just for avoiding any misunderstanding, we think it should also be about baselines and the monitoring framework. So just that it should not be too narrow in scope. And finally, when it comes to SBI, there's a line on, well, actually, we think, when it's about review, I understand it is included, but it should also be about the ratcheting mechanism. And in addition, we would like to see also the SBI to address issues of implementation mechanism. As I think many parties have insisted upon, implementation of the future framework is really a key issue, and that is typically, of course, for SBI to address. So also in that context, SBI should address the implementation mechanisms, the role of NBSAPs and potential guidance should also be considered by SBI, so that we would also like to see. And indeed, there's one additional meeting we would like to propose. That's the meeting that the Scottish government will host. We have mentioned it, and if you could include that in the land. It's on regional, subnational authorities in Scotland, so if that could be included. And, sorry, one further remark. We were surprised to see a change in the name of the workshop on area-based conservation measures. It now refers to management measures, but we don't see a reason for a change. I think conservation measure, we think it should still stay the same. Thank you very much.
Thank you, EU, for those input. We have been consulting here, my co-chair. Could you please?
Thank you. There is several group of change European Union suggest. Maybe I'll talk first about the one related to review mechanism. You will remember that we provided an in-depth briefing on resource mobilization that provided you with a good understanding of the various steps. We are not able to do that at this point here on accountability, planning, reporting, and review mechanism, as we're still in the formative stage, in the design stage of this work. There is ongoing discussion to ensure the good coordination of the various pieces, and there is rationale for including them now. So what I would recommend is that we will be posting the scoping document as soon as possible, and at that point we can have a discussion on how the various pieces relate to each other. So that's on that piece. The second point is more of a, there is a number of changes that are relatively easy to add, like adding the consultation from the Scottish Government is probably an oversight on our part, and we can easily do that. However, I'm wondering if the best use of our time at this point is to go through this level of detail about the annex, or to go paragraph by paragraph on the CRP.
Yes, thank you. I'm of course very much aware of the very limited time, and I don't want to prolong this discussion any further. I would just wish to check if we have a possibility on these elements. If they are not, I don't think they're that controversial. At least a number of them are definitely not controversial. It would be very nice if they can be included still. If there's any possibility to just have the non-controversial things still included,
Absolutely.
then we would be happy to just make the drafting proposals and help you to prepare very quickly the one further version.
So once again, this is an evergreen document. Please provide your comment in writing to the Secretariat, and then we'll make the update. With that, we would like to go back to the, we will go back to the paragraph by paragraph review of the document.
Okay, so let's go to preamble paragraph 1. Norway.
Thank you, Chair. Just a remark to the intervention by the EU about the annex. From Norway's point of view, there are also lots of, or some issues which we have regarding the annex, which we have decided not to raise in the plenary because we think it will affect the time we have at hand. So I would suggest not to make any changes in the annex. For instance, regarding the area-based management tool workshop, that was something we suggested in the Bureau to include sustainable use measures in the discussion about measures as well. So I think just the point is that if we are going to discuss the annex, which we know is not perfect, but it's sort of, it gives an overview of or an indication of the workload we have to pull through. I think we will spend a lot of time on it, and I think we can use our time more wisely than that. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I think the understanding is now that we actually proceed with the preamble paragraphs. For now, we don't have to submit more text on the annex. So let's look at preamble paragraph 1. We are now on CRP 1, for those who might not be together with us. Okay, then we go to Micronesia, please. You have the floor. Oops. Mexico.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Sorry for coming back to discussion on the annex. I think this is related to what we'll look at in the body of the main text. We think it's very important to have clarity. We need clarity on when we're referring to a zero draft and when we're referring to a preliminary text. Perhaps we have to make an amendment to Annex 2.
No, gracias.
Thank you. So perhaps we have to make an amendment to Annex 2 to clarify whether we're talking about based on a zero draft, drafting a preliminary document, because there's a confusion. I think this has to be very clear in paragraph 3 when we move forwards. If necessary, then we should make this amendment, though, in Annex 2. Thank you.
Mexico, my translation was not really working. So please, could you please just make your intervention again?
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Co-Chair. So I'm still referring to the discussion on Annex 2. Probably it will be necessary to make an amendment just to clarify what you're referring to when you're talking about a preliminary document for the post-2020 framework, or when you're talking about a zero draft. As we understand it, the zero draft will be the document that will be prepared as the basis for the work of the second meeting of the open-ended working group. And the result of that open-ended working group second meeting will be a preliminary document. So we need to make sure all the names are in line with one another to ensure understanding. So perhaps we have to amend Annex 2, where we're referring to the second meeting of the open-ended working group. So we need clarity on the sequence. So if first we have a zero draft and then a preliminary document as a result of the use of and negotiations concerning the zero draft, which will be prepared prior to that second meeting of the open-ended working group. So paragraph 3 of the document should make this very clear as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mexico. We will be working on this document, so in the next version, we will take into account what you've raised, and it should be more clear. My co-chair, do you have something else to say?
No, your Mexico has an eagle eye, equal to the eagle on their flag, and we will be aligning the terminology, and that's a very good catch. Thank you.
Okay, dear delegates, I have the floor now from Switzerland. Is it still on the same issue, or it is on the preambular paragraphs now?
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to clarify. I don't understand now if you accept amendments that has been proposed by the European Union, and probably other will come, or if you don't accept, as Norway has stated. And for me, or for our delegation, this is a very important issue, because we heard from Norway that they said, we changed this title in the Bureau meeting. So we were not in the Bureau meeting. So parties who have not been member of the bureaus must have the same rights. And so this is a crucial discussion. I would like to seek your clarification. Thank you, co-chairs.
Thank you, Switzerland. Just one moment. Okay, thank you, Switzerland. When you see us taking a bit of time, it is because we do not know the questions that come from the floor, and we have to try to share ideas here. So I think you raised some good issues here. Our proposal is that for any further input on this annex, we would appreciate if these are submitted to the Secretariat and the co-chairs will look at it. That's the way we are thinking through it, because reopening it now on this, we cannot conclude this here. So that is the suggestion that we are coming with, but my co-chair can again add something.
I think our colleague from Switzerland is pointing to, there is actually on the floor now two issues. One is some comments about location, time, organization of these meetings. And those are within the purview of the Bureau and ourselves, and I think it's not terribly useful at this point to get into details. You will be seeing change as we go, and we will, for example, in the next version, add the Scottish consultation, etc. The second issue is how we manage the scope of individual consultation. There was a question raised about the title of one consultation. As you know, we have created scoping documents that provide further detail on the scope. And my advice to the party is that it is not useful to discuss solely on the title of a workshop, but perhaps have a discussion on the agenda and what is included or not. And our desire is to have that discussion made through the drafting of strong scoping documents that we've started. So as a way forward, I think if Norway and Switzerland want to have a bit of a discussion, and we can, in the weeks to come, update those documents to make sure that the focus is right. I think your opinion as well as this comment on the title. So, the titles are useful, but what is crucial is to get the full language of the scope well understood. So is that, I hope that's useful to you. Thank you.
Switzerland?
Thank you, co-chairs. I'm still not very clear if you want completely not accept any proposals from the parties to amend it. I have a problem with the amended title, so that's true, and I agree that we could hand in our position and or discuss with Norway if it should be management or conservation. I think it's a big difference. But we have also the European proposals. These were concrete proposals, and some of them, as you rightly said, are easily to fill in. But we as party have to understand exactly how do you deal with the proposals that you hear now, today, when we discuss the CRP1. And therefore, I'm waiting for a clear answer to that question. Thank you.
South Africa?
Thank you, Chair. Just to agree with Norway and Switzerland on the status of those EU submissions, because we also had wanted to react to some of the proposals that had been made. So our understanding is that we are not taking those submissions.
Okay, let me try to see whether we can get some progress on this issue. Our standing now as a way forward on this is that there are views being expressed on this annex, and we could, if parties have their views in writing, please do submit, then we make adjustments on this annex, because the title there is preliminary list. Preliminary. There is nothing conclusive at the moment on that list. So if it is on the change that Switzerland is strongly expressing views on, we would see how to resolve that. So that is, I think, how we could move forward, because we may spend time a lot on this annex. Bolivia?
Thanks, Mr. Co-Chair. Apologies for coming back on the clarification questions raised here in this floor, but to us is not, with your last intervention, apologies, but it's not clear yet how we are going to deal with these adjustments. Because if there is no time for doing that on this preliminary list, which is very important and sets the path of what we are going to achieve soon with the post-2020 framework, then a note will be needed somewhere in the annex that says that this preliminary list was not fully revised by parties and does not reflect all the comments by parties. Thank you.
Bolivia, I think your suggestion looks to be one that can be taken forward, but let me hear Argentina.
Thank you, Chair. Argentina will address you on behalf of the GRULAC country members. We want to express, and I'm going to talk about what we are discussing in general. I'm sorry for that. We want to express our deep concern regarding the schedule and thematic consultations, since the proposal needs to reflect a better balance between the different views and interests of developed and developing countries, and it should respond to need and transparency criteria. In this regard, we will present different modifications to the CPR document in the following way. First of all, it is paramount to address the issue of means of implementation in its integrity. Therefore, we request the inclusion of a consultation on this issue to be open-ended and to be subject of review of SBI 3. Additionally, we highlight the need of the thematic consultation on resource mobilization to be open-ended, considering its strategic relevance for all the parties. That must not be a subject of controversy. We recognize the relevance of some thematic consultations present in the schedule, particularly the one related to ecosystem restoration, a priority for the countries of our region due to their variety of species, ecosystems, and high levels of endemism. Nonetheless, we state that there are critical issues that are not being addressed in the proposed calendar and that need to provide specific technical elements for the open-ended working group deliberations. Those lacking topics, some of them recollected in paragraph 6, must not be seen as optional. All necessary and additional efforts must be done for them to take place. In that sense, we as a group request the inclusion of thematic consultations on access and benefit sharing, as well as on sustainable use. Finally, GRULAC reiterates the need of having a proposal of zero draft of the Global Biodiversity Framework in a timely manner for the adequate considerations from the parties in Working Group 2. We request the co-chairs to present the zero draft during the informal open-ended working group session on November to provide us with sufficient time to prepare, also considering that December and January months are of holidays in our countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Argentina, EU, do you still have comment on the same? EU?
Yes, it is on the same. Just to note that, I see we are running into a discussion that potentially could be very long, and I see that we don't have time for that. Our request was focused on a number of relatively small and technical things. Of course, the deletion of a meeting is a bit bigger, but we could also accept simply some reference that instead of a meeting, we could also have an online or electronic means, just to have that reflected as in a footnote, that it's at least clear. The additional meeting in Scotland, it's an easy one. The issues for SPI on implementation are actually important because they also relate to the mandate and the concrete request that we do to SPI. So that is actually important for the process to have it included. Therefore, I would really hope we have a possibility to address at least the technical issues very quickly. I do hear, of course, Brazil, speaking on behalf of GRULAC, on Argentina, sorry, on other issues. I just want to, my first reflection is, of course, that there are indeed, I think, many more meetings and topics and work streams ongoing. So I'm not entirely sure this list is a complete list of all the meetings ongoing. There's the work stream on ABS and the Nagoya Protocol, on the Biosafety Protocol. So in that sense, a lot is in place. We fully agree that the means of implementation are extremely important. Whether one single thematic meeting on all of it is the most effective way of addressing it, we don't know. And we do absolutely, of course, agree that that there's a need to discuss about resource mobilization, and that's why we welcomed the German proposal for the workshop. So I think actually that all the issues are addressed in a rather balanced way, even though it might not be immediately visible. With our suggestions for 2 deletions, replacing them by online means, it might even be a bit more balanced. So with these remarks, I see we are a bit in a difficult situation, but if we can quickly do the technical comments, that would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, EU. Of course, my co-chair and I here do understand that this post-2020 process is going to generate a lot of interest and expectation from parties. So the position or the views expressed by Argentina on behalf of GRULAC, some of those plus what South Africa was trying to raise, still comes up to tell you how the expectation or the stakes are going to be high in this process. But I think we need to get some middle ground in all this as well. We shall have as many of these thematics as possible, but also I think we shall discuss and see realistically how we do them, because you're going to have time element, you're going to have resource element, especially the time element. Resources could actually most probably be there. But we're not saying with that we are discounting anything. All we are saying is that we have had this, and we need to be looking at this preliminary list, maybe much more in detail, and see how we incorporate all this, with the understanding that we also have this limited time to do all as being requested. My co-chair, you have something? Just a minute. Okay, we have had further consultation here. Let's hope that it can move us forward. We see, of course, that we can continue talking on this annex, and it may take us a long time. Now, we are proposing, if this is something we could accept, that let's consider the CRP. When we are done with the CRP, we are going to come back to this and propose a way forward on how we address this Annex 2. That is our suggestion. Definitely, we have some way we would like you to contribute to this later on, but if we could complete the CRP and then address this towards the end. Okay, I see no objection to that, so could we please go to these preamble paragraphs? Any views on the first one? The second? The third? Yes, European Union?
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. On the third paragraph, we have a few proposals. First of all, when we refer to decision of the COP 14/34, just to make sure that access and benefit sharing and biosafety are also covered, we would propose to refer also to the decisions of the Cartagena Protocol COPMOP 9/7 and the Nagoya Protocol decision COPMOP 3/15, so that we also in this way reflect access and benefit sharing and biosafety. Secondly, the current text refers to the outcomes of the discussion at these first meetings, and we very much appreciate the documents, and they are really a good basis for further work that is ahead of us. But there has been also a lot of discussions which are not directly reflected in the outcomes, and that's why we propose to make a change. Instead of referring to so when it's the part starting with drawing upon, it would read, drawing upon the discussions at this first meeting, comma, including the rich discussions under agenda item 4 on the basis of document CBD/WG 2020/1/3 and the outcomes of that meeting as contained in Annex 1, and it continues as it was. Perhaps I read it once again. So the part starting by drawing upon would read, drawing upon the discussions at this first meeting, comma, including the rich discussions under agenda item 4 in document CBD/WG 2020/1/3 and the outcomes of that meeting. And then it continues with as contained in Annex 1.
Thank you, EU. Were you on, just my own understanding, yeah. Were you on preamble paragraph 3, or you had gone to another one?
Paragraph 3, wasn't it? Am I too early? Apologies. Well, then
So
you have the scoop already.
Please keep the text because I failed to connect it here. But the Secretariat, I think, was taking note. I was trying very hard to actually see in that paragraph where that was fitting, but thanks a lot for moving ahead.
Actually,
But I took note of your proposal to include the COPMOP decisions and preamble paragraph 3. I think there might be an objection to that. Okay, Mexico, are you on preamble paragraph 3, please? Then we do with that.
Sí, señor presidente.
Yes, Mr. Co-Chair. Paragraph 3, preambular paragraph 3. No, sorry, it was operational paragraph 3. I'm in the same confusion. as the European Union delegate.
I think we are all eager to go the operation paragraph, so maybe we say that preamble paragraph 3 is going to be adjusted with the contribution that came from EU. EU?
I apologize for all the confusion, but actually we had also a small remark on preamble paragraph 3. No, I really apologize. And it's just in the decision 14/34 at last COP, we had paragraph 6 and 7 with a long enumeration of all interested organizations and stakeholders that need to be engaged. And we noted that actually in this version, it took the complete list as it was in the decision, and that's actually what we proposed. But somehow the business community, in the original text, it said business and finance communities. Just to avoid any misunderstanding or signal, let's copy exact text from COP decision 1434, because also the finance community is important, and just not to redo that negotiation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. EU, I think that is another additional comment. So with that, could we accept that those changes will be made by the Secretariat? And we can now move on to preamble paragraph, sorry. Bolivia?
Thanks, Mr. Co-Chair. Please, just for clarity, will you summarize what are going to be the actual changes in preambular paragraph 3? Thank you.
Secretariat?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in preambular paragraph 3, which begins reaffirming in accordance with paragraph 6 and 7 of decision 1434, we would add to the list of groups to be engaged there, business and finance communities. And the order, the exact placement of that, we'll double check with the text in decision 1434 so that it's exactly the same as what you adopted in Sharm el-Sheikh in decision 1434. But essentially it's to add the term business and finance communities to that list.
Secretariat, I think there was also a intervention from EU that we include COP-MOP decision on biosafety and the one from Nagoya. So maybe where would they fit in within there? Maybe just after, but let me get from the Secretariat where that we could fit that text. EU proposed that in addition to decision 1434,
No, they proposed that in preambular text, they posted in the operational text.
EU, I understand that is for operational paragraph 3. Yes. Your suggestion, is that correct?
Absolutely correct, yes.
Yeah, then let's move on. I was not getting it right here. So we could now move on to operational paragraph 1. I don't see any, so we move on to operational paragraph 2. The dates were corrected there. I don't see any. We go to 3. Mexico, followed by Colombia.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. With regard to the previous intervention, we would like to request that in the third line, the word preliminary be substituted with the word 0, so that it's clear that this is the initiation part of the negotiations, and the relevant amendment should also be made in Annex 2. Thank you.
Maybe just My co-chair has something to say here. Co-chair.
With regard to Annex 1, we would like to bring to your attention paragraph 1 and footnote 1 of that annex, just to reiterate the language of the annex is not negotiated text. Thank you, Francis.
Okay, Colombia, followed by Bolivia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. We would like to echo the statement just made by Argentina on behalf of the members of GULAG. And also in that regard, in this paragraph, we would like to make an addition at the end of this paragraph. And if you'll allow me, I'll read it in English. It states,
facilitate the work of the working group at its second meeting y adicionaríamos
we would add,
presented to the parties during the informative session of the working group in November 2019. Muchas gracias, señor.
Thank you so much, Mr. Co-Chair.
Colombia, could you please come again, just as they say, dictation speed?
Yes, of course.
Secretariat, I've just requested for another, the same submission, if we could please take note of it. Yes, Colombia.
Lo que solicitaba.
What we wanted to add is the following.
And to be presented to the parties during the informative session of the working group in November 2019. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Bolivia.
Thanks, Mr. Co-Chair. We also would like to say that we aligned of the statement made by Argentina on behalf of GULAG region. And in relation to paragraph 3, we have few comments. First, we agree with the suggestion made by Mexico. We believe it's important to start working on a draft text to be negotiated. Second, we think that the need of having this zero draft before the second meeting of the open and the working group is very essential. In that sense, we either could go by the suggestion made by Colombia or or adding the following text just after post-2020 global biodiversity framework in the third line of this paragraph to say a post-2020 global biodiversity framework, comma, before the second meeting of the open-ended working group, comma, drawing upon, and the rest of the text will continue. This because otherwise it's not really clear when we are going to have this text, and to us that's very important. Finally, it's not clear to us, as it was not clear, it's still clear yet how we are going to handle the suggestions on Annex 2. It's not clear to us how the adjustments needed on Annex 1 are going to be addressed. And we believe that since the document, this non-paper, reflects no consensus, it's a bit dangerous to put it in a status that is the outcome of this first discussion. So in the fourth line, we would like, of course, considering the suggestions made by the EU on this paragraph and particularly in this line, we would like to have clarity on how the comments on Annex 1 are going to be addressed, or delete the wording as contained in Annex 1 and just keep this document as a non-paper and information paper for next session. Thank you.
My co-chair, please.
Thank you, Francis. So first, let's talk about Annex 1. And I think the Secretariat has good advice on a way forward. Secretariat, can you take the floor?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think you have possibly two options of the way to deal with this. One would be, as the delegative, as Bolivia suggested, to delete the reference to access to Annex 1. The other would be to replace the phrase "and the outcomes of that meeting" as contained in Annex 1 by simply including Annex 1, so that you're not giving it the status of outcomes. You could just say including the note in Annex 1.
Bolivia.
Thanks, Co-Chair, and thanks to the Secretariat for these options. We rather prefer our suggestion to delete the mentioning of Annex 1 and to keep it as other information paper or as non-paper for next meeting. Thank you. And if you allow me, for either 2Bs or 3Bs, we have a text suggested. So after we finalize the discussion on paragraph 3, please allow me to come back again for this additional text that we would like to suggest. Thank you.
Okay, I think you proposed that we could make reference as a non-paper other than.
Remove the reference.
So I think that we could go along with that, but let me hear if there are any objections to that. Okay, then I will request European Union, please.
Thank you very much, and apologies for taking the floor. It's just that I'm sure what the conclusion is, but also to say that we've been working hard. We had lots of discussions, and we came here with the hope that we would get clarity on structure, the scope, and the procedure, the work plan. Perhaps not all the clarity might be there that we had hoped for, but I think we made good progress. So in that sense, for the credibility of the process and actually of reflecting that we worked hard, I think it would be good to refer to in one way or the other, to the conclusion, to the non-paper in the annex, so that we can also really show to the rest of the world that we did have some outcomes. But it could be, for instance, outcomes including the annex. But I'm not entirely sure what now the latest proposal was, how to phrase it. If you could repeat it or consider our suggestion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, EU. I think we were also giving Secretariat a bit of time to be adjusting the text as the discussion went on. So Secretariat, could you be ready with the text?
So, thank you, Mr. Chair. So the paragraph with all the amendments so far would read as follows. Request the co-chairs and the Executive Secretary, with the oversight of the Bureau, to continue the preparatory process in accordance with decisions 1434, CP 97 and NP 315, and to prepare documentation, including a zero draft text of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework before the second meeting of the working group, drawing upon the discussions at this first meeting, including the rich discussions under Agenda Item 4 on the basis of document CBD Working Group 2020/1/3. And here we have the area where we are discussing. So it could be, one option is, and the outcomes of that meeting. The other option would be including Annex 1. And then we continue, as well as the outcomes of the 11th meeting of the ad hoc open-ended working group on Article 8J and related provisions, and the 23rd meeting of the subsidiary body on scientific, technical and technological advice, and the results of other relevant meetings, consultations and workshops, and further submissions from parties and observers in order to facilitate the work of the working group at its second meeting. There was then, following then, a earlier suggestion made by Colombia, which may be replaced by the one subsequently made by Bolivia. And that was, and to be presented to the parties at the informal session in November 2018. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So we now have, you have been read the full change, and there is two options on the table. So we're seeking views on those two options.
Argentina?
Gracias.
Thank you so much, Mr. Co-Chair. Argentina would like to support the proposal made by Bolivia so that there should not be a specific mention to Annex 1, because we think that although it's a very important contribution for the continuation of these discussions, it is not more relevant than any other contributions that we have for the elaboration of this zero draft. Thank you.
Mexico, please. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. Thank you also to the Secretariat for taking good note of the compilation of the amendments. We are in agreement with the first part up as far as the word zero draft and including the text provided by Bolivia so that it should be before the second meeting of the open-ended working group and including the discussions at this first meeting. Perhaps there is too much detail if we include the mention on the basis of item 4. Those, although it's important, but if we want to use the option of the Secretariat reading including Annex 1, Annex 1 is not only the result of all of this, it's one of various outcomes. So to include Annex 1 would be quite a good formulation and would give justice to the many, many hours that we have all invested in contributing with further elements to assist the co-chairs in drafting this first zero draft to have a basis for our future negotiations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mexico. Bolivia?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. In order to move forward, we would like to make a suggestion on the text as suggested by the Secretariat when referring to Annex 1 in this paragraph to say, including the preliminary views as contained in Annex 1. Although the Annex 1 in the preambular paragraphs mentions this, that there is no agreement and no consensus, for us as the main body of this document, the CRP, to us it's very important to include this issue of preliminary views, because to us, as you will see in our comments sent by the Secretariat, we have 3 major issues on content. So we cannot give it as a status of official outcome of this meeting. Thank you.
Bolivia, I think that is a good suggestion from at least us here on the podium. That's what we tend to agree with. But let me now hear, perhaps Secretariat could make a little bit of adjustment on the text and then again read it out, Secretariat.
So this part of the paragraph would say, and to prepare documentation, including a zero draft text of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, before the second meeting of the working group, drawing upon the discussions at this first meeting, including the preliminary views as contained in Annex 1, comma, and then continue.
Thank you, Secretariat. Can we move forward with that? Nigeria, you have the floor.
Sorry, I pressed Nigeria's button. This is Norway. I know I'm the first one to make this
Okay.
mistake. So
Norway, you have crossed to Africa. Anyway.
which is not a bad thing.
Right. Do you want to press your button now? Not.
Yeah.
We wouldn't. Yeah. Please do. Norway.
Thank you. So just regarding having the proposition of having a second draft, sort of a zero draft before the second meeting, I'm just curious if this is practically possible. And I would then ask the co-chairs maybe to answer that question, because I'm not sure if we will, because I mean, this package or the framework consists of a lot of elements that needs to ripen. And I think it's a conscious decision has been made by the co-chairs, or a proposition to have this zero draft at the third meeting. So I'm just wondering about the effects of having the zero draft at the second meeting instead of the third meeting. Thank you.
Norway. South Africa, are you raising on the same issue, or it is another accident? South Africa?
Co-chair, you still owe me 2 minutes, but it's on the same input, because our understanding was this draft that we are expecting will at least start to show us a structure, and it's only a preliminary draft, because we were hoping at some point to start seeing a document we can begin to engage. So that was why we were happy to go along with the proposal to have something that is substantive by the second meeting of the working group. So we wanted to support it, and also support the text proposed by the Secretariat as compromise text. Thank you.
Okay. I think, dear delegates, I see the time, what you see on the screen. My co-chair and I here, in terms of having these drafts in place, I think we have committed ourselves a lot to working as much as we can to make sure that by the time you come in November, there will be something for you to look at. That's what we want to do. So it is not that you'll just see what is in this Annex 1 remaining as it is. No. There will be some improvement. And a zero draft, as I hear it, is a zero draft. It is just zero. In fact, I don't know whether there's a negative draft, but it is just zero. It is zero. So at least we are not on the negative side. We are on this way. So we are committing ourselves to that. But co-chair, if you have something.
Yes, just to provide, I've heard many good suggestions. What we intend to do is prepare a draft in November with all the elements that we would have by that time. And then the intent was to facilitate a discussion at this informal information session. And if Substar want to provide and is able to provide advice, that would be most welcome. By the time we get over the year-end break and we prepare, I can't remember exactly what is the 6 weeks deadline to the second open-ended working group. By the time of the 13th of January, you would have another version that would reflect whatever input we received in November and in early December. So that is the plan that we have in mind. Thank you.
Mexico?
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Co-Chair. we reiterate that our intention is for there to be clarity. We need clarity that we'll have one document to begin negotiations during the second meeting of this open-ended working group. And then there we'll talk about targets, about objectives, other aspects. But we need to be sure that zero draft is not the result of a third meeting, because that won't leave time for more negotiations leading up to the conference of the parties. We need it to be very clear. For the second meeting, we will begin serious work and negotiations in order to have sufficient time to have an adequate and appropriate program. Thank you.
Co-Chair, you have something to say?
The answer is yes, Mexico. Thank you.
Okay. It is my understanding that some of the text that was read a few minutes ago by the Secretariat is what we are going with now, Secretariat.
So I'll read the, following that last discussion, I'd read the entire paragraph. So, request the co-chairs and the Executive Secretary, with the oversight of the Bureau, to continue the preparatory process in accordance with decisions 1434, CP 97, and NP 315, and to prepare documentation including a zero draft text of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework before the second meeting of the working group, drawing upon the discussions at this first meeting, including the preliminary views as contained in Annex 1, as well as the outcomes of the 11th meeting of the Ad Hoc Open-Ended Working Group on Article 8J and related provisions, and the 23rd meeting of the subsidiary body on scientific, technical, and technological advice, and the results of other relevant meetings, consultations, and workshops, and further submissions from parties and observers in order to facilitate the work of the working group at its second meeting, and to present a preliminary version of the zero draft at the informal session on November the 24th, 2019.
Thank you. With that, I take it that we can move ahead to the next paragraph, but let me consult here concerning the time now that we will have left on how we move with this document. All right, I hope you are all prepared. We are going up to 2:30. Okay, let's go to paragraph 4.
Thank you. Francis asked me to follow up with paragraph 4, and I see Mexico followed by Bolivia and the European Union. Mexico, tienes la palabra.
Gracias.
Thank you, Co-Chair. And sorry for coming back to paragraph 3, but there seems to be a mistake in the way that it was read out. There's a chronological error, because we can't present for the informational session the document which will contain all contributions, including SUBSTA 23, because that meeting is one day before the meeting of SUBSTA 23. Maybe you can find a way so that this is chronologically correct. At the moment it's saying that we'll have a presentation of this document, including contributions by the SUBSTA, at a meeting which takes place one day before SUBSTA 23. Thank you.
Thank you, Mexico. I suspect there's been some misunderstanding. The draft 0 is to be presented at open-ended working group 2, and a preliminary version would be available for November. But as you say, we can probably reverse the order of mention of those two meetings. Thank you, Mexico. Moving on to Bolivia.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. We have two comments. The first one is in line of what Mexico just said, because there is another issue. If we are going to say at the end of the paragraph that this has to be submitted in November 2019, that is not consistent with what we are saying the 23rd meeting of the subsidiary body. So SBI is not going to happen, but the first half of 2020. So there are at least two issues of chronological order that we need to fix here, and perhaps we can give this to the Secretariat to redraft this. However, what is important to us is that the 0 draft, even if not completed, is handed out to parties and other stakeholders before the second meeting. We wouldn't like to see that changed. This is one thing. The second thing is, as mentioned in a previous intervention, we have a suggestion for 3Bs. Could I read it now?
Thank you, Bolivia. Before you get to 3bis on your first question, indeed, the 0 draft will be provided 6 weeks in advance. So I want to be absolutely clear.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chair. What I was referring, and perhaps I didn't explain myself well, is that this 0 draft, before the second meeting of the open-ended working group, is not going to be able to have the inputs of the SBI 3, because SBI 3 is going to happen after the second meeting. That was my point. Sorry if I wasn't clear. Now, please, if you tell me, give me guidance on the text that we have.
Thank you for your patience, Bolivia. Please go ahead with reading your suggestion for a 3bis.
Thank you. Following up the dynamic that we have in these days, and considering that there is already a few parties that have submitted some suggestions for a structure on the post-2020, we have the following text to suggest as 3Bs, that it was handed out to the Secretariat before too. And it says, invites parties, other governments, relevant organizations, and stakeholders to submit to the Secretariat proposals on the structure for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework by the 30th of November 2019. Let me explain a bit the rationale of this. One, as mentioned, is that there are already some parties who have proposed some structure. There are others informally, all of them informally moving around. We would like to have all parties the opportunity to propose this structure, one thing. And the second thing, one of the main objectives of this meeting was to work on the structure. And thirdly, we believe that if this is going to submitted by parties in November, we are on time to provide further inputs for the 0 draft that is going to be handed out before the second meeting. I put this under the consideration of the plenary. Thank you.
Thank you, Bolivia. In fact, indeed, we welcome suggestion on the structure. We were discussing in terms of the timing. Ideally, if we're preparing a preliminary 0 for November, the best for us would be to get the suggestion by mid-September. So that would be the ideal. Like if you could be okay with that change, that would be the best for us. So if the Secretariat would be kind enough to read the revised Bolivia version with the new date. I see you typing furiously on your keyboard and maybe being ready. So, Secretariat?
Thank you, Chair. So this would be invite parties, other governments, relevant organizations and stakeholders to submit to the Executive Secretary proposals on the structure of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework by 15th September 2019.
Australia?
I've got a comment on 4. So do you want me to comment about that now or leave it for a discussion on Bolivia's proposal?
My understanding is that we can go along with the proposal from Bolivia, then we go to paragraph 4.
Sure.
Okay, then Argentina? Is it on Bolivia's submission or you are now Argentina?
Yes, thank you, Co-Chair. Para Argentina sería
For Argentina, it would be important that the topic of submissions be considered in the drafting of the zero draft. If we leave it in paragraph 4, it will be unrelated to the inputs which should be considered for the zero draft.
He's worrying for nothing.
Argentina, maybe that is in paragraph 3. Argentina?
Sí.
Yes.
3, it says, drawing upon the discussion at the first meeting, including the preliminary views as contained in Annex 1, and somewhere in the other things that should take into consideration should say, and the submissions of conceptual notes. I don't know if Bolivia's suggestion should go before to invite proposals for conceptual models in order to have these proposals also included in the elements that the co-chairs have to consider to draft the zero draft.
A Secretariat?
So I note that paragraph 3 already refers to drawing upon and further submissions from parties and observers. But perhaps this would be clearer if we put 3 bis before paragraph 3. So it become 2 bis. And then that reference that already exists in paragraph 3 would be clearer.
Thank you, Secretariat. I think we can go to paragraph 4. Australia?
Thank you, Co-Chair. My comment is in relation to the discussions that we've had so far this morning. Many comments seeking clarity, I think, on the role of Annex 2 and more detail. And I note the Chair's desire, Co-Chair's desire to come back with more detail in Substa. I thought it might be helpful to be explicit about that process here. And so I have a proposal for a 4 bis and a 4 ter, which I'm happy to read out, and a slight amendment to 4 to capture that. Yes? Okay. So on paragraph 4, the proposal would be to keep the text all the way up to Annex 2 and then delete or move the rest of that sentence into a 4 bis, which would read, requests the co-chairs and the executive secretary with the oversight of the COP Bureau to prepare a detailed work plan which outlines the mandate and modalities for how parties and others can engage in each meeting, consultation and workshop contained in Annex 2 and added to thereafter, comma, and how each output will be considered in the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, comma, for consideration at the 11th meeting of the ad hoc open-ended working group on Article 8J and related provisions, and the 23rd meeting of the subsidiary body on scientific, technical and technological advice, comma, and this is where I pick up the moved last sentence, so recognising that implementation of the work plan will require flexibility in order to adapt to changing circumstances and to respond to emerging opportunities. So this would enable the co-chairs and the executive secretary to put more detail around the aspects of Annex 2, what each meeting is, pick up the additional elements of, we note later in the decision there are comments around different thematic working groups. There will be moments where you're seeking input, as just discussed by Bolivia, and this would be a helpful document for all of us to go back home to engage with stakeholders in national contexts. And with that in mind, a forteur recognises the importance of this document, and a forteur suggestion would be notes development of such a work plan will enable parties to facilitate engagement, including at a national level, in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework consultations in a comprehensive and participatory manner in line with Decision 14/34. Thank you, co-chairs.
Okay, thank you, Australia, for those for your intervention. Now, of course, we had said earlier that we are going to have a way forward on Annex 2, and our suggestion would be to take this to Friends of the Chair, and therefore the text that you're proposing will be considered at that level. So that is how we are going to be handling Annex 2. So with that, could we, maybe parties who would like to take more on this particular paragraph, to now hold it until we are in Friends of the Chair, and we consider the others. European Union?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Perhaps just a quick reply on the text proposed by Australia, if that's now the right time, or would you take that up later?
We will take it later under the Friends of the Chair, because we want to consider Annex 2 through Friends of the Chair in paragraph 4, and paragraph 4 for that matter. Switzerland?
Thank you, Co-Chair. I see, of course, the connection within the two subjects, or the proposal that has been just made by Australia and the annex. So how exactly do you want to organize the Friends of the Chair, to understand if there is a party involvement in it, that we can understand and that we feel represented in the outcome that is delivered, because there is a sense of not really understanding what is going on, how thematic themes come on the list, and if they are open or not open. So it is really important for us that we understand exactly in a transparent way how this decision is done. My government asked me to come home with a work plan, because it is very difficult to engage with other ministries, within our ministry, with other stakeholders, if we don't have a clear idea how is the process structured. Therefore, we would support the suggestion by Australia. We would like to have it now in paragraph 4, add it as a basis for the further discussion then on the Annex 2. Thank you.
Thank you, Switzerland. Just a minute. Thank you, Switzerland. In case I don't communicate it properly, my co-chair will also add to my voice. The agreement here is that the Friends of the Chair will be open to all. So parties will be welcome to participate. And then secondly, this text proposed by, was it Australia, will be considered by Friends of the Chair, and we'll get back here. That is the guidance we have from the podium here. Mexico, followed by Colombia, on the same, I hope.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Co-Chair. We see that a good outcome is that this be revised in your Chair's Friends group. But we do have a question on this 4 bis, which will be considered. We should take into account that this should be as appropriate, as we say under this convention, because deadlines for the presentation of working group, documents for 8J and for Subset 23 are defined. So sending these should be considered appropriately, because we want to ensure that we have all working documents and not omitting any just because of a chronological issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mexico. We take note of what you're saying. I think, again, we are saying that you will have the opportunity to really look at this when it goes to the Friends of the Chair. So you could make your addition or further input on the text at that level. Colombia.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Colombia would like to request that you please read out the proposal made by Australia once again. Thank you very much.
Colombia, let me just make, call it a humble request at this point in time. We have advised or guided that paragraph 4, together with text that has been proposed by Australia, be looked at when you're at the Friends of the Chair. So Australia will have the opportunity to take the floor again to repeat what they submitted here. We are saying this because we have already given you opportunity to discuss it there. Not that that text will not be read or will not be shown there. So Australia will have that opportunity to again come up, and I think you'll have more time to actually look at it when Australia will be reading it and the Secretary will again read it to you. So please, if you could bear with us, that you look at that text or the proposal by Australia when we reach there. Thank you. Now let's go to para 5. I see. Okay, European Union.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. We have a few additions to propose to this paragraph. So at the end, when it ends with the conference of the parties, we would like to add, in particular, comma, and with reference to the findings of the IPBES global assessment, and then 3 indents, so little a, invites Substa to consider specific goals, targets, and indicators, baselines, and monitoring relating to direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. B, invites the ad hoc open-ended working group on Article 8J to consider relevant aspects of implementation relating to transformational change. And the third one, C, invites the informal advisory group for mainstreaming to include in its report to SBI 3 concrete proposals as relevant. We think, just to explain the rationale, we think we should be clear on what we request. So these are really just clarifications so that we make sure that Substa, Article J, and SBI and the informal advisory group know what is expected. Thank you.
Thank you. EU. Secretary, did you get? You got it? No. Okay. EU, could you please take the floor again and maybe dictation speed?
Thank you. So at the end of the paragraph, it would continue with, in particular, and with reference to the findings of the IPBES global assessment. First indent, A, invites Substa to consider specific goals, targets, indicators, baselines, and monitoring framework relating to direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. Second indent, in B, invites the ad hoc open-ended working group on Article 8J to consider relevant aspects of implementation relating to transformational change. And the third indent, C, invites the informal advisory group for mainstreaming to include in its report to the SBI 3 concrete proposals as relevant. Thank you.
Thank you, EU. Just a moment. Some consultation here. Secretariat, Co-Chair, is it? Co-Chair.
Thank you. It's always useful to see the guidance and precision. And a couple suggestions, European Union. in considering the role of Substa versus the role of the open-ended working group, instead of consider, I would suggest we use something like provide guidance or provide elements, and then go on with your list of sub-bullets. The second point, and that is something you know, we may want to discuss a little bit, on your sub-bullet number B. Transformational change is a very wide concept, and obviously there is elements relevant to AJ, but there is elements relevant to many other body. So I'm wondering whether there is a formulation that could precise what, or maybe you want to tell us a little bit what you meant by as relevant to AJ and not including that on the others. Thank you.
I think before EU takes the floor, I have Bolivia has been on the screen here. Bolivia.
Thanks, Mr. Co-Chair, and thanks for your remark, because that's exactly of what we were wondering, why the work on traditional knowledge, or why transformational change has to be restricted to traditional knowledge. Although we see many merits on having the ad hoc working group on AJ to provide specific input and analysis on this process. So perhaps what we could do is to rephrase this invitation to the working group on AJ to consider relevant aspects on traditional traditional and local knowledge, and others that really give the relevance that it deserves to the work of IPLCs. But also we would like to hear from the EU why they are placing transformational change this year. Perhaps they have some inputs to share. Thank you.
EU.
Thank you very much for these questions, and also thank you to Bolivia. Perhaps first on the first, for the substa and the suggestion to replace considered by another word. What we actually also would like to see from the various thematic meetings is proposals. So perhaps we could also invite substa to make proposals, or provide proposals. On indent B, my understanding is that the working group, Article 8J, has already a mandate from the last COP to address issues relating to the post-2020 framework, and transformational change is something was not covered yet, but it would be clear that it is an important element. But obviously, traditional knowledge is also important. So perhaps we can combine them.
Thank you, EU. Secretariat, maybe I give you the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, I wasn't quite clear in terms of the point on the working group on Article 8J in relation to transformational change. Obviously, there will be elements relating to transformational change which would come, for instance, from the discussion of the drivers and the indirect and direct drivers of biodiversity loss being considered at substa in light of the IPBES global assessment. There might also be elements of transformational change that are relevant to mainstreaming that would be looked at by the IAG along the lines of your proposal. I'd note also that we have 3 days for the meeting of the working group on Article 8J, and it already has quite a full agenda. Of course, the points you make with reference to substa, I mean, there's already an agenda item on that relates to this and substa, but in terms of 8J, this would be a major new addition.
Okay. With that explanation from Secretary, could we have EU again to come back with the text?
Later.
Okay, Co-Chair.
Thank you. What we're wondering whether the EU would be amenable to provide us with a modified version of that text in a little bit later, in a few minutes. Yes. Thank you, EU.
Argentina.
Gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. Argentina would like to recall an item relating to this, which was presented in the discussions of the groups yesterday and the day before. In our opinion, this is going beyond the scope of the CBD when we speak about direct and indirect drivers relating to biodiversity loss and the report of IPBES. I don't think that this should be included. This would bring into our agenda issues that belong to other processes and other agendas, including economic issues, and goes beyond the scope of CBD and the framework that we're seeking to build.
Okay, New Zealand.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Yes, I was just wanted to pick up on the proposal for the new paragraph B in relation to Working Group 8J. And I note that the request has been for the EU to come back with some more precise language on this, which I would very much welcome. I think that we owe it to those who are preparing for the various meetings, and in particular for this meeting, in order to have a very focused discussion on these issues. We need to be very, very clear, I think, what we are asking of people. And I myself am struggling with the reference to the relation to transformational change in this context. So I do look forward to the more precise wording that we hope the EU will be able to bring to us later. Thank you.
Thank you, New Zealand. Colombia, then Bolivia, and possibly we move forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to refer to the 5 leverage of transformative changes that has been posted by IPBES. There are some technical and more scientific approaches and issues, such as the socio-ecological transitions, and there are some other alternatives or ladders related to governance and decision making on biodiversity. And in that sense, it would appear there is a cross-cutting issue that could be attended in AJ, okay, but it must be attended as appropriate by SBSTA and SBI as well, considering the 5 leverages. And I think when we close the discussion in the 5 leverage of transformative changes of IPBES, we find also a way to limit the scope of these considerations, as the New Zealand colleague was saying before. So there's a relation between the elements proposed by the IPBES and the specific agendas in SBSTA and SBI, and in that way there's some opportunity to limit the discussion and to address it as a cross-cutting issue. So the proposal of Colombia would be that this to be addressed not only by AG, but also by SBI and by the SBSTA. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colombia. EU, and then I will invite, if there will be comments further to that from parties. EU, I see, of course, I have Bolivia and Mexico on my screen here, but let me give the floor to EU.
Thank you. You may have seen that has been some talks behind my back, so I read the outcomes. Little a is about SBSTA, so invites SBSTA to provide elements
on specific goals, yeah, common, yeah.
comma,
elements on
elements concerning specific goals, targets, indicators, baselines, and monitoring framework relating to the drivers of biodiversity loss. Little b, when it's about Article 8J working group, invites the ad hoc open-ended working group Article 8J to consider relevant aspects in developing its work plan. So that's broad to cover the relevant elements. And then little c invites the informal advisory group for mainstreaming to include in its report to SBI 3 concrete proposals as relevant. So I think that was not changed.
Thank you. I hope the Secretariat has captured that, but if we need to get back to you, we will. Bolivia, followed by Mexico.
Thanks, Mr. Co-Chair, and thanks to the EU. We think that this latest proposal is much clearer. We are still reviewing it, but when we hear it says invites in little b, when says consider relevant in developing its work plan, perhaps we need to be more precise on which work plan we are referring to. Is for the work plan towards post-2020, the work plan post-2020, if that makes sense. But we need some clarity on which working plan we are referring to. Thank you.
Just before I give the floor to Mexico and Argentina, let me give the floor to the Secretariat.
So COP has mandated the working group on Article 8J and related provisions to develop proposals for the future work program on Article 8J and related provisions, and that those would be considered as inputs to the post-2020 framework. So I understand the work program here would be to refer to that work program that is already the main agenda item for Article 8J, and we will use the precise text as per the COP decisions.
Okay, thank you, Secretariat. Mexico.
Gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. As the Chair of SBSTA, I would like to make a mention and to have us take a reality check on the proposal for new tasks for SBSTA on the drivers of biodiversity loss. In SBSTA 23, we are due to be dealing with a document on climate change and others on sustainable use, which in a certain way will deal with those drivers. And also we are due in SBSTA 24 to speak about exotic invasive species. There are other outstanding issues relating to pollution, loss of habitat for SBSTA 24, but as I mentioned earlier on, the limit date for the working documents for this is 25th of August, and the documents respond to specific decisions made by the Conference of the Parties. And here we're being asked for additional information. I would like to suggest that at the end of it, under subparagraph A, we include as appropriate and as feasible, because we are being asked for something which may not be exhaustively completed by the time of the next meeting in November, and we need to be able to prepare better for the meeting. We could perhaps do this for the meeting in May 2020. Thank you.
Thank you. Mexico. I hope Secretariat has taken note of that. Before I invite more interventions on this, just to let you know that we have a few minutes, maybe about 50 more.
45 minutes.
45. And we will not even have 1 second after 2:30. That's what I was informed by the interpreters. After, not even 1 second after 2:30. 2:30, just end it there. So let's try to maximize the time we have. If we could try to finish this so that the friends of the chair could really start work when we break off. So let's be mindful about the time we have ahead of us. But having said that, let me hear from Argentina.
Gracias.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair. For Argentina, it's very important that we invite SABSA to provide specific elements considering objectives, targets, indicators, baselines, etc. This would relate to the 5 drivers relating to biodiversity loss, and also in the context of Objectives 2 and 3 and Article 1 of the Convention.
European Union?
Yes, thank you very much. Sorry for taking the floor. Just to respond to Mexico, we are fully fine with adding as feasible, but because we do realize not everything is feasible. But precisely in this context, it's really important that it becomes very clear up front what is feasible, because there might be quite a few gaps that need to be addressed, and it has so far not been clear how they will be addressed. And there are a number of topics and issues that we want to be addressed in the preparations. So we would really urge, well, the co-chairs, the chairs of SPI, SBSTA, the Bureau, all of the Secretariat, to make clear and make sure that all the issues are covered. For instance, we would like to see also in the framework, in the preparations, to have that there are all preparations for potential targets concerning plastics and marine litter, or issues relating to climate change, which so far have not been covered, health and biodiversity, and also soil, city, urban biodiversity. So I really wanted to mention that these are topics we want to somehow be covered in the preparations, and we're fully aware that this cannot all be done in SBSTA, certainly not SBSTA 23 and 24, but that we seek clarification, not in the decision, not today, but it should be soon, that how these issues will be prepared and addressed. Thank you very much.
Just a moment. Thank you. We were consulting a bit here. Now, let me request this, before I give the floor to parties here, let me give the floor again to the Secretary to read the text now as is. We see whether that can move us forward. We need to really finalize on this paragraph as well so that we can move forward. Secretariat?
So, we're adding to the end of paragraph 5, in particular, and with reference to the findings of the IPBES global assessment, invites SBSTA to provide, as feasible, elements concerning specific goals, targets, indicators and baselines, and monitoring framework relating to the drivers of biodiversity loss. Little b invites the working group on Article 8J and related provisions to consider relevant aspects in developing its work program its future work programme. And paragraph C invites the informal advisory group for mainstreaming to include in its report to SBI 3 concrete proposals as relevant.
Brazil?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As our European colleague was saying, we would also like to see some topics included, and I didn't get it from this last sentence that was read, if sustainable use and benefit sharing would be also included in this solicitations to the SBSTA. And we also agree with Argentina that indirect drivers of the IPBES report are out of the scope of this convention, and they are much more economic topics that are to be discussed in another forum. And we would therefore ask in the first sentence regarding SBSTA, the elements that SBSTA will provide, that it specifies that it's only regarding direct drivers of the IPBES report. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Brazil, Bolivia, Mexico, and Norway, and please, then we get a way forward on this.
Thanks, Mr. Co-Chair. 2 comments in the order as the text stands now. First, we believe that the text on drivers as proposed by the EU is comprehensive enough. We would like to just leave it as drivers, because this is what IPBES has worked. And it's very difficult to prejudge now what is very relevant or not to the post-2020 framework that we want to build. So let's leave it general and let's leave it as drivers, is our suggestion. And our second comment is not really sure what adds to say as feasible when we are inviting SBSTA to provide inputs on things that SBSTA really should provide as elements for goals, targets, and etc. And we heard Mexico, and we are very lucky that we have the SBSTA chair here to also provide us guidance. Certainly this is not going to be feasible for SBSTA 23, but at SBSTA 24 is going to be really feasible. So our suggestion is to say either SBSTA 24 to make it explicit, or just to leave it open, but to say SBSTA as feasible, that's really confusing to us, because it should be feasible, is SBSTA tasks. Thank you.
I'll now give the floor to Mexico and Norway, then we try to get a way forward on this.
Gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. Thank you, Bolivia, for the clarification. The limitations that we have for SBSTA 23 should be made clear. We will make progress, of course, but what I want to make clear is that for the Friends of the Chair who are going to be analysing Annex 2, it has a direct connection with the preparation of what's being requested of SBSTA now. Some of the thematic workshops of experts can provide contributions that SBSTA will be able to analyse in SBSTA 24 to deal with those points. And so I would like to recommend to the Friends of the Chair that they take into account the necessary changes that will have to be made to Annex 2 in order to be in line and to have the contribution so that SBSTA is able to carry out this most ambitious task, which includes targets, indicators, baselines, and other elements which are somewhat complex. Thank you.
Thank you. Norway.
Thank you, Chair. This intervention is about Brazil and Argentina's intervention about indirect drivers. I think our view is that the current strategic plan is well within the material scope of the convention, and For instance, target 4 is about sustainable production and consumption, and target A is about addressing the underlying causes for biodiversity loss. So I think in this sense, I think it's quite clear to us that also indirect drivers might be, is under the scope of the convention, as long as it has something to do with the loss of biological diversity. So I think we're quite, we would go along with Bolivia's proposals to use the concept drivers. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted us to move forward, but I see Colombia.
Yes, thank you so much, Co-Chair. We think after hearing the new proposal that definitely we could not leave out direct and indirect drivers and transformational change. And this is very important and goes in line with the interventions that Argentina and Brazil did also, to make sure that when we speak about transformational change, this is within the objectives of the convention. Thank you so much. And by the way, we want to invite everyone also to continue to have an open mind for this discussion, especially guided by the principles of this process, which we agree it to be flexible and adaptable as we move on to this new framework. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now I will take the opportunity to, I think, reach the end of this if possible. Just Secretariat, if there's any other change now in the text.
Argentina there.
Argentina? Could you, okay, Argentina.
Sorry, Chair, I did not understand.
Please continue.
Okay. No, simplemente...
Just according to the statements made just now, we'd like to highlight that there's an issue in terms of focus, in terms of how we want to work on this topic. Before beginning to discuss issues which lie outside the scope of the convention, we have to discuss the balanced implementation of the convention. So we have to discuss the 5 direct drivers and the other 2 objectives, which are the main objectives of the convention. Thank you.
Eswatini?
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to highlight what the previous speaker has highlighted, that if we are to look at, to have the drivers considered, we also have to consider issues of sustainable use and equitable sharing of benefits.
Thank you. Just let me consult here a bit. Okay, Co-Chair.
That's a good suggestion. So in the proposed text from the European Union, under sub-paragraph A, we would add a reference to sustainable use.
Bolivia?
Thanks, Co-Chair. If you allow us to build up on your suggestion, in little a, our suggestion will be that after the paragraph to add comma, in relation to the three objectives of the convention. So in that way, the concerning specific goals, targets, indicators, baseline, etc., will refer to the three objectives of the convention. Thank you.
Thank you. Bolivia will be requesting the Secretariat to give us a reading of the text. Brazil?
Thank you, Chair. Just in line with what my Bolivian colleague has just said, so it would be sustainable use and benefit sharing in the sentence, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Secretariat, maybe just a moment.
So my understanding is that under paragraph 5, little a would now say invite SBSTA to provide elements concerning specific goals, targets, indicators and baselines and monitoring frameworks for relating to the drivers of biodiversity loss in relation to the three objectives of the convention.
Okay, I take it that that is acceptable. Let's now move to Argentina.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Apologies for insisting upon this. But to be frank, the COP gave us the mandate to negotiate this framework. And they told us to, I don't think they gave us the mandate to discuss such a wide-ranging discussion. So when you talk about drivers and loss of biodiversity, so we don't necessarily have the mandates to tell SBSTA that they need to set out targets and objectives on biodiversity loss in general. So I would insist upon what we could do to move beyond this is to clarify that what we're going to ask SBSTA is that developing targets, objectives, etc., on direct drivers of loss of biodiversity. It would be good to have a convention to deal with all of these issues as a whole, but we don't have the mandate to do so. So the implementation of this convention requires us to focus on the three objectives of the convention. Thank you.
Co-Chair.
Thank you. I think there is a good suggestion in terms of simplifying the wording, and I'll read. Invite SBSTA to provide elements concerning specific goals, targets, indicators and baseline, and monitoring framework. No, stop. Okay, so I repeat. Invite SBSTA to provide elements concerning specific goals, targets, indicators and baseline, and monitoring framework, period, full stop.
I might have to call on some parties to really combine efforts on this because it is proving endless, but let me hear only two, then we shall definitely get away on how to handle this. Otherwise, it's going to be another paragraph. Which other paragraph was that? Dealing with the Annex 2. 4. Okay. Norway.
Thank you, Chair. So regarding the mandate of the SBSTA, I think it's quite clear that the SBSTA has the mandate to look at drivers of biodiversity loss. Thank you.
Bolivia.
Thanks, Mr. Co-Chair. We can go along with your proposal of simplifying text of little a, but in addition to that, to make it comprehensive and building up on previous suggestions by other GRULAC parties, we would like to suggest that at the end of the text in paragraph 5, it says, for achieving a transformational change in the scope of the 3 objectives of the convention, because we think that these 3 little aspects that we have here, they are going to address us to this aspirational goal, which is transformational change, and all the activities need to be explicit that are under the 3 objectives of the convention. Thank you.
Thank you. Bolivia? Just a moment. Now, definitely the request will not end on this. I'm just requesting the Secretariat to read. If it is not, then there is a proposal that we have for us to resolve this. So, Secretariat, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, following Bolivia's suggestion, I believe it would be invite SABSTA to provide elements concerning specific goals, targets, indicators and baselines and monitoring frameworks for achieving transformational change within the scope of the 3 objectives of the Convention.
Okay. I see maybe we still don't have agreement on this.
So those 4 can go away.
So let me propose this. Okay, could I have the following countries, please? And I would like you to use maybe some corner of the room there to look at this. Bolivia, EU, Norway, Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, Eswatini, Costa Rica, I think Brazil here as well. So if those countries could please just try to harmonize this text somewhere behind there, and I'll call you maybe in about, it could be just a few minutes, either 5 minutes before we close. If you finish earlier, so much the better. Then we see how we move forward. So with that, we'd like to now move to the other paragraph so that we are not bogged down by this paragraph. We are not making progress here. Please choose a leader or amongst you, someone a party to come and read for us what you'll have agreed on. So let's go to paragraph 6. Understanding that those who are taking the floor are taking on paragraph 6, please kindly do not take us back to paragraph 5. So I have Colombia.
Oh, yes, thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much. No, we just want to thank Bolivia for the compromise, and we, in paragraph 5, and depends on the discussions now. For para 6, we would decide if we will insist on the insertion of indirect drivers and transformational change, but for para 6, thank you. And we have a proposal for 2 additional paras after para 6, like a 6 bis and a 6 ter. So you will let us know when you want us to incorporate that. Thank you so much.
Let's first agree whether we be paragraph 6 as is before we invite you for those other additional text. If it is acceptable, then we can invite you. So, Bolivia?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Please allow me to comment first. Since my delegation is composed by 1 person, with your indulgence, we are not going to be able to participate in this informal consultation, and we reserve our right to comment on the outcome of this. We are not trying to delay the discussions, but we believe that our concerns are also important. Being said that, let me go to paragraph 6. In general terms, we agree with it, but there are a few things that are missing. One thing is that here is not reflected the gender-responsive approach, which is already in Annex 2 and in the issues and thematic consultations and issues that are programmed. So after pollution, we would like to add gender-responsive. So it will be gender-responsive and rights-based approaches. Then we are very happy to see here sustainable use, but if we see in the program of future work, it doesn't appear anywhere. So there is a really big inconsistency there, and to us is very important, and we hope that is something that the Friends of the Chair is going to adjust. After sustainable use, we would like to include also issues on access and fair and equitable participation on benefit sharing, but then we have the issue of where we are going to allocate that in the tight schedule that we have. And also for us, it's very important to mention drivers and transformational change. So our suggestion is in the fourth line to read sustainable use, comma, access and fair and equitable participation of benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources, comma, drivers and transformational change, comma, pollution, comma, gender-responsive and rights-based approaches, and the rest of the text will continue as it stands. Thank you.
Thank you. That is a proposal from Bolivia. Argentina.
Gracias.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Just like Bolivia, Argentina reserves the right to comment on the outcome of the group meeting in the corner of our room. With regards to Bolivia's proposal, Argentina could accept it. We'd require more clarification, though, on what you mean by drivers and transformational change in general.
Add means of implementation. Thank you.
Okay, I'll give the floor to EU before I'll ask maybe Bolivia to explain as per request. So, EU.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. This paragraph risks, of course, becoming quite a big Christmas tree. There were quite a few topics that we also think are important, and on some other topics we might have some questions or doubts, and so we would actually approach it differently. We think we should not try to have now a complete list here in this meeting, but rather leave it to the co-chairs and the executive secretary in consultation with the COP Bureau, who includes also the chairs of SBSTA and SBI, to identify additional thematic issues. That would shorten and simplify the drafting, avoid quite a bit of debate here, and there are ways for everybody to make clear which topics should be addressed. So our proposal would be to redraft it saying, request the co-chairs and executive secretary in consultation with the COP Bureau to identify additional thematic issues with a view to preparing options to respond to the interests expressed by parties for thematic workshops. And here one additional remark relating to an earlier comment. It should not be only about thematic workshops, but it could also be about other means of consultation on such topics. So we would add at the end, before on such topics, the words and other means of consultation. Thank you.
Thank you, EU. I see that you are proposing some changes. Could I have the floor now given to Australia?
Thank you, co-chairs. we would support the proposal put forward by the EU. I think it's a nice solution without getting into a long shopping list of everyone's preference for those missing items. I would also seek to put a time frame on when these options would come back, and our preference would be that it would come back to the 11th meeting of Article 8J and the SUBSTA as part of the work plan discussion. So the proposal would be at the end of the amended text as per the European Union would be to add and for consideration as part of the work plan discussion to be held at the 11th meeting of the two relevant. To save on time, I won't read it out. The two meetings, Article 8J and SUBSTA.
Okay. Co-Chair?
Thank you. Building on the useful suggestion from Australia, I think I would recommend that we bring that to the informal briefing in November.
Okay, give the floor to Costa Rica. Costa Rica.
Thank you, Chair. Costa Rica support the Bolivia, including in the paragraph 6, means of implementation, gender responsive equality, and ABS. Thank you, Chair.
Mexico and then South Africa.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Co-Chair. We would like to include the topic of voluntary commitments. This was also discussed in prior sessions of our group, and on the proposal of summarizing by mentioning additional topics and nothing more, we believe that it would be convenient to explicitate the priorities of the various delegations so that they're not lost in something generic. This also relates to the work that the group of the Friends of the Chair will revise on Annex 2. Thank you.
Thank you, Mexico. I'm going to give the floor to two parties, and after that I will ask the Secretariat to read for us the text and see whether we can move forward with that. South Africa, followed by Bolivia.
Thank you, Chair. We agree with the proposal from Australia to give a time frame for this prioritization process, but we do feel that it's important for us to list their specific elements. We were hoping that in the Friends discussion on Annex 2, we would resolve the priority aspects, because the issues around the means of implementation and our work around unlocking those specific areas, because some of them are going to require targets and baselines and proper systems to be in place. So we would like to keep that list, which will assist with balance and include the technical and scientific cooperation on that list of outstanding issues that are substantive for this process. So we would like keep the Australian edition at the end and have the full list of issues identified, unless we find somewhere else to have those items highlighted.
Thank you. Bolivia, then I'll request the Secretary to read for us the text.
Thanks, Mr. Co-Chair. First, I would like to clarify something on the proposal we made, that perhaps it's not the best wording, but when we refer to drivers, we meant to drivers of biodiversity loss, no other thing. And we understand that making a very detailed list of issues that are relevant to us could be very lengthy and difficult, but we also would like to share the concern that we see that the preliminary future program of work is quite dense, and many issues that are there, we are not really sure how they come into the work plan and how they have become thematic consultations. So we believe that it's very important to put balance on what we are going to be working on in preparation to the document for the post-2020 framework. We would be able to go along with the text as suggested by the EU with the following addition, that not leave it so open, but to say additional thematic issues in that line, that is the end of the third line, to add, to approach in a balanced manner the three objectives of the Convention under gender-responsive, intergenerational equity, and rights-based approaches, comma, with the view, and the rest of the text will continue. What is our concern, Mr. Co-Chairs, as expressed by many parties, is that we are not still seeing in these thematic workshops a balance between the three objectives of the Convention, and that's worrying us very much. So we hope that this issue is going to be solved also with the Friends of the Co-Chairs that you have established. Otherwise, we see a danger of not having an equilibrated post-2020 framework. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll request the Secretariat to read for us. We only have just even below 5 minutes before this session is adjourned. So, Secretariat? Sorry? Thank you so much. We're also trying to get a balance on this text. It is not very easy to balance. But Secretariat, let's see whether what you have now can move us forward. Hopefully
so
it will.
What I have following the proposal by the EU and then the addition by Australia with the change suggested by the co-chair and then the additions by Bolivia, request the co-chairs and the executive secretary in consultation with the COP Bureau to identify additional thematic issues to approach in a balanced manner the three objectives of the convention, and gender responsive, intergenerational equity and rights-based approaches, with a view to exploring options to respond to the interest expressed by parties for thematic workshops and other means of consultation on such topics, and to present this for for consideration at the informal session on November the 24th, 2019.
Could we go along with that proposal, that text now from the Secretariat? Of course, we know, as I said earlier, that having these thematic areas expanded is good in a way, but we have to balance it with the time that we have. So maybe when you go to the Friends of the Chair, you will be able to look at the realities of doing this within that time. We really know that there are things that other parties want included. But let me now give the floor to Costa Rica, followed by EU. And then we will close, I suppose, after that. We only have 2 minutes, under 2 minutes. I was told not even 1 second will go up for us. So, Costa Rica, and please be brief.
Thank you, Chair. I didn't hear the name of Costa Rica supporting the proposal that you have been read. And also we want to address that in relation to this paragraph, Costa Rica desea hacer un llamado especial.
I'd like to make a special call to our partners in order to address topics of sustainable use and pollution in enough depth so that they be adequately incorporated in the post-2020 framework. If it's our goal to talk about objectives and topics and to develop these objectives and targets with indicators, this needs to be integrated. And we need to consider a greater range of issues and challenges which affect biodiversity. We cannot see biodiversity as we did in the 90s, Costa Rica believes, just in an isolated manner. We have to break the current cycles and see biodiversity as part of a wider range of issues. That's why we believe that the addition of these topics needs to be included. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Costa Rica. I think now with that, we are at 2:30, so let me consult here. It seems we shall not have any further interpretation at this point in time. I will get back shortly with the announcements. I'll give the floor to my co-chair.
Thank you. I understand there is agreed text for 5A that we will come back to first when we resume at 4 o'clock. With regard to the friend of the chair, this is going to be a group open to all parties that desire to be there. However, we would very much like to see Mexico, the European Union, Argentina, Bolivia, Australia, and Switzerland be part of that group. And we are very thankful for Norway for agreeing to take the lead of that work. The Secretary will inform us on the room. And then the mandate is about this paragraph and the Annex 2, we carry it forward. So I will now pass on the floor to the Secretary.
Thank you, Chair. Seems a little chaotic this morning. I just have 2 announcements. One is that the Friends of the Chair will take place in CR, Conference Room 9, which is on the roof. It is on the roof, and you access it from the main corridor. So you go up 2 floors from here, and it's on the roof, CR9. And finally, the last session of the information session will take place today, and it will be in CR4, in conference room 4, and it starts at 3 p.m. So it's last information session in conference room 4 at 3 p.m. Thank you.
The meeting is adjourned.